So I think we can get started. Welcome everyone for sparing your time for this very important webinar on a subject understanding FDA's shift from computer software validation (CSV) to computer software assurance (CSA). What is the new validation approach? And I'll just give you the little bit background how we chose this. As soon as the new guideline came from FDA, many of our customers were confused really whether CSA is going to replace CSV. What are the new things they will have to do? Obviously, everyone was doing risk analysis before as well, but I think there was more emphasis on risk analysis in CSA. So we thought, why don't we have a webinar to give you a background of our understanding and also answer any of your questions which you may have. Some people have shared their questions already, so we will cover those questions as well. But I think that's the whole context of why we have chosen this topic to do the webinar. Niyati, can you move to the next slide? Yeah, so I think I've joined with my co-panelist Niyati. She and I will do majority of the webinar today, but some housekeeping stuff, and all of you will be muted during the webinar. And you can submit your questions while Niyati and I present and talk about the subject here. But you can also ask questions during the Q&A session, at almost the end of the webinar. And in case you have any additional questions after the webinar, you can always email us at contact@saracasolutions.com. And Niyati and I have also shared our email IDs at the end of the webinar. You can also reach out to us if you want to have a one-on-one session with us. We will also going to publish replay of this webinar on our YouTube channel. So you are always feel free to share with your colleagues, or if you want to re-listen to the webinar, you will have an opportunity to re-listen onto our YouTube channel. Can you move to the next one, Niyati? So this is me, Kuldeep, as you know. So I'm almost 20 years, more than 20 years in medical device and pharma industry. Initially worked as a developer, designer, and then all the way to doing quality regulatory with variety of large organizations, J&J, Philips, Thermo Fisher, Smith & Nephew, and many more. I also worked with mid-sized companies as well as startups to help them understand the regulations around the world and how do they make sure that they are compliant and have the best product in the market. I have a lot of experience working on GXP, IC 62304, and CSV approaches, and a good experience on European, US FDA, and Japanese PMDA, TGA in Australia, CFDA in China, and many other regulatory bodies around the world. Now, I would request my co-panelist Niyati to talk about herself and take us forward in this webinar.
Okay, thanks, Kuldeep. Hi, everyone. So I'm Niyati Patel. Thank you so much for joining us today. So my background, I've worked in the quality, compliance, regulatory validation areas for nearly 2 decades now, across pharma, med devices, biotech environments. In this session, we'll focus, very just like Kuldeep touched upon on how the computer system validation, the CSV, has traditionally been applied by companies where it works well, and where it can hold us back. So we'll also look at how FDA's newer software assurance, computer software assurance approach shifts the focus from the towards the efficiency and risk-based thinking and risk-based assurance. So my goal here really is to share practical examples and lessons which are relatable, so you can take away when you go back to your own organizations and companies and try to implement them. So we'll try to keep it live and interactive as much as possible. Okay, so let's jump in. Okay, so here's our agenda for today. We'll start with an introduction to CSV and its role in the pharma, medical device, and the healthcare industries. We'll then focus on how CSV is performed, including like typical deliverables and steps that you need to take, followed by some common pain points and challenges. And next, we'll review GAMP5, which is a very critical phenomenon when you're doing validation of computer systems. And then we'll pivot into CSA. So we'll talk about what it is, what its framework from FDA is like, how it compares with CSV. We'll bring into some real world examples and some use cases, talk through implementation strategies and some challenges that we have seen and I have seen in my experiences. And then Kuldeep will basically wrap up with regulatory expectations and summarize key takeaways from the webinar. And then at the end, we'll close with a Q&A. Okay, so introducing the CSV. So, many of you have heard this term, computer system validation, which is really all about demonstrating that a computer system consistently performs as intended. It's been the gold standard in a lot of regulated companies for decades. The problem really with CSV is that it often, ends up being more about the paperwork and less about the assurance. So it can become sort of a box checking activity instead of a risk-based activity. And sometimes that becomes a pain point in companies, and that's why it led FDA to introduce this new concept called CSA. So a quick reality check, CSV, how it's applied in the medical, pharma, and healthcare environment. So really, it asks for producing evidence that a system meets, or does what it's supposed to do, and it does it consistently, and you can defend it in front of regulatory bodies or auditors. So in practice, CSV really touches every part of our business. If you have a computer system, you would really be touching upon the CSV processes and concepts, and it applies to anywhere from ERP systems to EQMS systems, which is the electronic quality management system, to your lab instruments or LIMS systems, or your MES systems. Those are the manufacturing execution systems, or even device software. If you have any devices that are used as a software or software which is in the device, that there also CSV applies. So in pharmaceuticals and medical devices, this matters because systems does touch release, product release, stability, lab testing, and a lot of quality decisions are made that are critical. And so, device, for example, the device software for a SAMD device, you also have to add design controls per the IC 62304 guidelines. And so you often need to balance the validation and the design aspects and the artifacts of design control. So the challenge then becomes that, not all systems are equal in terms of patient safety or product quality or data integrity or compliance. And so historically, CSV has been applied with the same heavy hand across the board. So it really treats everything the same. And that sometimes becomes inefficient because you're wasting sometimes time and energy in treating everything across the board the same way. And so that's where, inefficiencies creep in. It becomes heavy and loaded and burdensome sometimes. So we'll unpack, how to avoid that as we go through the rest of the presentation. So let's look at a real world example. This is one of my past experiences when I worked for a commercial pharma manufacturer. We had a project where we migrated an on-premise system, which was a quality management system, to a cloud-hosted EQMS system using traditional CSV methods. So this project took several months. It was closer to a year. It involved multiple teams across, quality, IT, operations, and the vendor itself. While the outcome was good and solid and inspection ready, the process became very resource intensive. So the pain points were, too many test scripts, duplicate, evidence from the vendor and the customer, and then, which reduced slower, the review cycles became slower and approvals were longer. And we saw some unexpected gaps in suppliers' documentation. So that created extra work for us. So that also then added on to the user adoption. So the end users were also took much more time to get trained, and the adoption was much slower because most of the focus was on documentation rather than, practical training of users. So keeping this example in mind, we'll keep this picture in mind as like a CSV before example, because we'll have an after example. We'll review another example later, which would be a CSA style example, and there we'll look at, how we used vendor artifacts and vendor system and testing and prioritized our testing based on that, and how we trimmed the effort while keeping the same level of compliance and same level of assurance. So this slide is all about the validation approach that we typically take in CSV. The key steps are really defining your intended use, what the system is intended to do, and defining your requirements, creating your specifications, running the necessary IQs, OQs, PQs, and then producing a final validation report. So it's a very brief way of sharing that, and I've really shared that briefly. It's a lot more than that when you talk about the full validation package. But those are the main elements when you start out with CSV process. And supporting all of that is like a traceability matrix, which really links your requirements to your testing. So those are core deliverables that the agency, just like FDA or EMA or others, they expect from companies. And the process is thorough, the process is very detailed. But when you apply uniformly across all systems in your company, then it becomes very excessive. So especially if you have low-risk applications, such as Linux or a Microsoft application, or a very small piece of statistical software, for example, sometimes you have to ask a question, are we really testing what matters for product quality and patient safety, or are we testing everything? So that's where the mindset shift, comes into play, and that's where the shift, that's the shift that CSA encourages. So let's look at some concerns, with CSV, right? So in conversations with some teams that I've worked with and worked for in my past, I sometimes hear similar themes like, there's too many test scripts, or there's too many procedures, or there's too much documentation with CSV. There's a lot of duplicated testing. People feel the sense that there is a lot of repetitive testing, which then creates longer approval cycles, lots of reviews and approvals to take place before you can close a deliverable, and a lot of gaps sometimes that a supplier's documentation produces. So that can cause rework. You have to then come back and rework or do a CAPA to correct those issues. Sometimes we focus with CSV a lot on generating artifacts and just deliverables, and then we forget to train users, which is most important part of the system, is to really train your end users and how they will be using the system on a regular basis. And also we lose focus on improving our processes and taking the time to improving and changing our processes where they don't work. So the result is that projects would finish technically and they're compliant to the regulations, but then operationally they become weak, and that becomes costly. So overall, the length of time, the effort, and everything else adds to the cost. So the goal is really, let's be defensible, but without being wasteful. Okay, so GAMP5, what is GAMP5? It's good automated manufacturing practice. Some of you may have heard about this guidance. It's very well known in the industry when you're looking at computerized systems and validating them. ISP set this guidance in 1991. It's a practical toolkit, gives you a very simple common language and explains you the life cycle steps and approach. It gives you guidance on how to scale using risk. And then it also kind of diverts you to involve your suppliers early in the process so you don't duplicate their work. I like using GAMP5 as a backbone. It helps your teams make validation consistent. Your decisions are solid about what to test and why to test it. So, you could think of it as like applying a good judgment repeatably. And it really is structured into these 4 categories, 1, 3, 4, and 5. They each have their own risk level or what comes under each of the categories. Think of it like applying a good judgment when it comes to categorizing your systems. Some of the things you need to remember, when you're looking at GAMP is your product well and your system well, learn or know your process well. You try to apply a life cycle method to your system, and then try to scale by the actual risk. You use good risk management, decision making, and definitely try to leverage the suppliers' documentation and evidence. And also don't forget to define roles and responsibilities upfront, which is very critical. Sometimes companies forget to do that, and it creates a lot of confusion and issues later. Because if responsibilities aren't clear, you then have to rework the same things repeatedly. So that causes a lot of pain. GAMP also gives you a menu. So like it's sort of a step-by-step menu of what to produce, but really your risk assessment, your URS, your supplier assessments, validation planning, functional specifications, design specifications, IQ, OQ, PQs, traceability matrix, validation report. So those are some of the areas to touch upon when producing your deliverables using GAMP. And it's a practical step. You pick from the menu based on your system's category and its intended use. And for example, for like low risk systems or SaaS systems that are low risk, supplier evidence is enough, plus some targeted testing. So that may just serve well enough. And for comprehensive, ERP or manufacturing systems, you'll have to use the full suite of implementations. So it's important to document your rationale when you really pick the category in your procedures and processes. And when you do your risk assessment, make sure you document your rationale of why this software comes under a certain category and really justify that.
Niti, if I can ask a question on this slide, the previous one, a lot of us use Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, and I was wondering which category that would fall into. And the supplementary question is, sometimes we have Excel spreadsheet with a lot of macros, which make our life easier. Would it come in the same category, or if you have macros, then the risk category may be different? If you want to just say a few words about those.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for asking. So, typically just a simple Microsoft Excel under those, Microsoft application would typically come in the category 1, which is just, standard software that supports your business and not really directly involved with GXP decisions or GXP processes. There's no configuration. So that sort of falls in that category 1. But, when you talk about macros and when spreadsheets are used with some very comprehensive formulas and calculations, etc., you then start to talk about, how secure are those formulas, and do you need to really validate that spreadsheet, and, what's the risk if there are any, issues with the data using those formulas. So that's where you start to maybe drive it towards, either moving from category 3 or even 4. I've seen sometimes very comprehensive spreadsheets that are used for quality decision-making purposes, classified as category 4, because they are somehow customized. They have a lot of risk in terms of decisions related to GXP and quality. They have formulas in there. So that's where the access controls and the security of the data comes into play.
Great, thank you.
Of course. So we'll move to the next area. So again, when you decide you want to use the GAMP method and the guidance, when you look at your deliverables for validation, you can ask these questions to yourself that, what is the intended use of my system? Could a failure affect product quality or a patient safety? What type of evidence exists from the supplier that I'm purchasing the system from? So this form of mapping from like intended use to supplier's evidence to your targeted testing, that's what's going to save time for you while you still keep the assurance level high and strong. So it is really about the mapping of your risks and the mapping of what your intended use is to really drive the decision making. Okay, so this brings us to CSA, the computer software assurance. Well, what is that? What does it really mean? Well, CSA isn't a shift really, or a new concept. It's not a shortcut. It's really a targeted risk-based effort. It's a mindset. Let's just say, it's a new way of thinking. Instead of testing everything, it really drives the focus on functions that impact, product quality or patient safety and have the biggest potential impact on those areas. So it's a very risk-oriented mindset and risk-oriented approach. FDA published this guidance. It's available for everyone to read. It's on FDA's website as well, and we have shared a link to the draft guidance at the end of the presentation. So you feel free to review it at your convenience. But yeah, it was published by FDA in September of 2022. It's fairly recent and new. And it really expects, FDA expects through this process to document your critical thinking. So you have to ask yourself, why you tested what you did. This type of clarity will reduce, wasted efforts and repeated testing or repeatability that you typically see with validations, and it'll make your audits easier. And evidence is really curated. You're building your rationale and documenting it. So definitely, when you do audit, you go through audits and inspections. It'll make your process and your evidence easy to present to the auditors. So we'll look at some of the what's in scope and what's not in scope in the guidance. So really, the draft guidance targets all of your GXP systems, whether it's a production system or a quality management system. All of them come into the life cycle, and everything that's in the QMS life cycle is really applicable. Even when we talk about design controls or software as a medical device or software in the medical device, the device function still requires design control to be intact. You have to follow design control requirements, but CSA really complements those frameworks. So use CSA, for example, for your production system or QMS system, and still keep the IEC 62304 and the design history files for your design device features. So it kind of complements the different requirements when you talk about medical devices, and software within the medical device. It really complements those frameworks. So a very practical, layout or framework when we look at, what CSA is built upon. So you start with, an intended use statement. We did discuss that a little bit while ago, but, you start to define your intended use, document that intended use statement, build a risk assessment, and prioritize the risks based on your use cases or functions. Try to gather a systems architecture or overview, just so you understand the high-level overview of the system and its design. Typically, suppliers provide that. If you're purchasing a software from a vendor, which is a cloud application, for example, typically the architecture diagrams are provided by the vendor, so you can leverage them. And then try to, prioritize the risks and build the user requirements based on risk prioritization. Do a targeted verification for high-risk functions, and then, try to concise the quality, the end of the validation, try to concise and build a assurance report. So that would be basically your validation summary report. This assurance report is really key because it's defensible. It explains your reasoning, why the risk approach was taken the way it was taken by you, and you'll be able to defend it well with auditors and regulatory agencies. When you implement CSA, define the intended use, classify the functions by risk, document your reasoning, try to do targeted verifications, collect as much supplier documentation that you can, and that applies, and then produce a good summary report. So that's really the sort of output that you would want to achieve when you use the CSA framework. And then the final product really should very clearly show you, where the effort went, why it was concentrated in that area, what type of risks were taken. And basically, that's what auditors want to see at the end of the day.
Niyati, one question, if I may ask here.
Sure.
We will do a CSA summary report, and we will also do a CSV report in some fashion, right? So they will be two different reports which auditor would like to see, or is there any way to sort of combine them, or like CSV report could become like an actual part of CSA? What are the best methods which notified bodies or auditors are looking to see?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting question. So, when taking the CSA methodology, Kuldeep, you try to build that validation, final validation summary report with that risk-based or evidence-based thinking in mind. And you have shown that you've selected, um, your intended use and your risks and the level of testing that you've done appropriately based on what really impacts product quality and patient safety, like we talked about. And so a lot of that will kind of conclude in your validation summary report when you're explaining your results and summarizing everything. So in that process, you really don't have to go through that traditional, CSV validation report. You can kind of tailor the summary report based on, what level of testing you did and what were the highest impact areas, and really just focus on those. So it kind of cuts down on the effort of how much to put in a summary report as well. With
Okay.
CSV, traditionally, you would really summarize all the efforts and tests undertaken. When in here, you would really be focusing on those high impact areas and the high risk areas and what level of assurance you achieved. So it's a very tailored and sophisticated way of doing it, and also less effort, which really benefits all the companies.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for asking. So we'll go to the next slide where we will talk about what the risk-based approach looks like. It 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 really means, this is just an example grid which is a 3x3 risk-based grid. A lot of companies, I'm sure you guys have used it at some point if you've ever done risk assessments in your company. But the approach is really to prioritize what is the impact and what is the likelihood. So what happens if something fails, and how likely is that? Which that's really what this is about, and the ratings based on your impact and your or likelihood. So like high consequence or high severity items will get the biggest testing efforts, and so on. And then of course the low consequence items will get lighter testing with documented justification. So you have to still document your justification of why there's less level of testing required, uh, but it should be defensible. So you try and use your cross-functional judgment. You meet with your stakeholders, from quality, IT, and also the process owners for each of these areas, and you try to collaborate and discuss and see what type of risk-based thinking do we need to apply, and how can we avoid this sort of checkbox testing, which doesn't add value. Trying to do each and every box and trying to meet all the check boxes, which can add a lot of effort and time, like we spoke about earlier. What can we avoid, or what can be defensible, and where do we want to put the most effort? That's really the discussion that you have to have with your stakeholders when you're looking at the risk-based approach. And when you're also looking at CSA, it's very important to look at your vendors. So the whole vendor management process is critical, because you're leveraging a lot of what your vendor has done. The basic steps are when you start out with determining selecting who's the right vendor for your company, who's going to be providing the system, or you're going to be purchasing from the vendor. Start out with qualifying your vendors. Make sure your vendor management process is is strong and solid. Capture their test evidence, their validation, their approach. Try to set out like service level agreements with them upfront, and make sure you include compliance responsibilities so that they are able to meet your compliance requirements. Also make sure, they include all the supply artifacts, their testing, their architecture documents for the system, any type of test reports that they've produced. So, you can eliminate some of that duplication that we saw earlier with CSV. When you try to map these areas appropriately and try to map them to the intended use of the system, you start to avoid some of that duplication. So you're really putting a lot of control on your vendor and their QMS and their methodology, and leveraging a lot of those vendor based evidence and artifacts into your CSA validation process. But you must document applicability, how it applies to your company and your business. And that is very important. So really, having a sort of a vendor alignment workshop or a collaborative meetings with the vendor early on in the project will save you a lot of time later. And, even with CSA, good documentation practices are non-negotiable. They're really, really crucial in regulated environments, as you all know. Alcoa Plus principles still apply. You have to have control documentation, make sure you're recording data real time, and the data is traceable. Alcoa Plus really, is a very widely used concept, but really is all about data integrity, making sure data is attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. So I'm sure you're familiar with these terms if you've done data integrity work at your company. And yeah, instead of a pile of a lot of redundant scripts and testing, you try to look for how you can achieve consistent and concise assurance reports, and also link evidence or objective evidence that tells your inspection story clearly and quickly. So it's more of a brief summary of how you can show that you've done data integrity work and in compliance with the requirements, but also on a risk-based area, in a risk-based manner, and concise and clear and simple. And the Alcoa principles touch upon all the required, computer system regulations like Part 11, 21 CFR, Part 11, EU, Annex 11, and even the ISO standard for medical devices, the 13485. Okay, so CSV and CSA, let's look at the comparison, how they compare with each other. CSV is comprehensive. It's prescriptive, as we looked at. It's very, very detailed and heavy. It is robust and it's solid and very defensible, but at the same time, it's very complex. And on the other hand, CSA is targeted and reasonable, and very efficient. And of course, both are auditable. Auditors would look at both approaches and how you've really implemented them in your company. But when they're done right, you hold the highest standards of regulatory compliance, and you can meet regulatory expectations with both. So the main difference where sort of CSA takes you to the next level really is, you document the thinking behind your testing and your decisions, right? So that narrative is really important, and it's very, very persuasive and approachable for auditors when you present it in an inspection. So we won't dive into a lot of the aspects here. Feel free to read through the comparisons and how they really compare to each other. But that takeaway is really that CSA is an approach that is very practical, approachable, and takes you to the next level when you're thinking about risk-based quality. With CSA, what are the benefits and changes that you can expect? So if you take CSA, it really reduces your validation burden. So if you have low risk systems, definitely speeds up your process. It speeds up your validation in general, and the delivery times for your project. It also lets you reuse the vendor's evidence and documentation and testing reasonably. So you can practically apply that, as we discussed earlier. It makes your audits and inspections very efficient and easy because evidence is focused and curated rather than a lot of the checkbox testing. And the benefit is practical. You can, there's tons of benefits if you really apply CSA. I have experienced it firsthand by using CSA in my validations. But it is practical. It's faster projects, less rework, higher compliance and regulatory defensibility, and of course, savings of time and cost overall. So here's that other example I mentioned earlier when we touched upon the CSV example in my past experience. So here's a real world example, this time using CSA. I worked for a pharma company where we supported a project where we replaced the legacy LIMS system, which was an on-premise system, and LIMS really stands for Laboratory Information Management Systems. It's a laboratory system. We replaced the legacy on-premise system with a SaaS version. So we took a CSA approach. We basically scoped and narrowed down our scope into just the very high impact areas and very critical GXP workflows. So that included, sample logging and sample management, stability studies, for example, or CFA generation. Those were some examples, but those are, for us, were high risk or high impact GXP areas, and so we focused our efforts in that area. And we use suppliers' test documentation for non-critical functions, wherever there were less or no criticality existed. We leveraged suppliers' documentation and focused our testing on really heavy areas like data migration, for example, from the old system to the new system, and any integrations that had to happen between our new LIMS system to other business applications. So, the result really was the validation effort overall for us reduced by 30%. Compared to a typical CSV method, if we would have used a CSV approach, it was very fast. And ultimately, when we had the FDA audit, it went smoothly with no observations or issues. So that's really the end result that you want to see, where you pass the audit with no issues or observations. In terms of adapting the strategy of CSA, right? So if you're planning to adopt, start with a gap analysis. Try to compare CSV practices to CSA principles and understand them well. Try to define your risk criteria. Update your SOPs and templates and procedures in your company accordingly. Try to get familiarized with the CSA guidance from FDA very well. Train your teams. Pilot on a low risk project or a low risk system where the risks are not as high, and try to pilot the CSA approach in a low risk system, and then scale. Using your outcomes and results from a pilot testing to everything else that you have to do in your company. So try to always document your decisions and rationale, And that's what really makes CSA defensible in front of an auditor. And then expect, sometimes with a change comes cultural resistance. In the beginning, you'll have some people in your company teams that resist the new approach or resist the change, which is okay. Sometimes you'll see vendor documentation gaps in the beginning, which is definitely something that you may come across. But try to work and mitigate these items with really good training. Training workshops early on, clear SOP updates, procedures that are implemented well. Those are things that will help you. And try to do it as a phased approach, so that the phased approach keeps the risks manageable, and you can try to work them through as you build your confidence and implementing CSA across your company. And don't forget, celebrate small wins when you implement a small scale project and it's successful. Celebrate the wins and build momentum with your teams. So with that, I'll hand it over to, I'll conclude and I'll pass it to Kuldeep to summarize our webinar for today.
Thanks, Niyati. I think wonderful work in explaining a lot of real-time scenarios and the difference between CSA and CSV. So folks, to summarize, what we have covered today, we know that CSA is a risk-based approach, for your product, and it is aligned with an FDA CSA draft guidance 2022, which you can download from FDA website to know more about it. Data integrity is very important. So audit trails, e-signatures. We have seen in Corona time zone that e-signatures were become quite popular. There were a lot of tools, but many of them were not really validated. But since we had no other options, we had to use them. But now I think there is a good advanced level of tools validated which we have, and that makes life a little bit easier to make sure that they have the level of cybersecurity which is required. Supplier and cloud governance. So share responsibility. Now we have EQMS systems. They are mostly hosted onto the cloud. A lot of data goes to cloud for pharma manufacturers, device manufacturers, and there's always this question: how secure is my data? Right. So I think if you do an risk-based assessment of your cloud system, along with your supplier, you would actually understand at a deeper level that most of these sophisticated software are quite secure, and so that you can weigh risk and benefit in utilizing them. Cybersecurity readiness, threat modeling, patching, secure configuration, incident response, right? I think it becomes very critical to take any small incident really seriously and do a root cause analysis to make sure that you identify the real problem and fix it so that you don't really have a bigger incident later on. Traceability design control, which is very critical in whatever we do in pharma and medical devices. So your URS design, your test linkage, 62304 has a very good framework of traceability, and obviously ISO 14971, the latest version, has very nice way of tracing your product from start to end. QMS alignment. So we have, if your company is global, and I believe most of you have global companies, so it becomes very important that you have 21 CFR 820 and ISO 13485, which is the golden standard around the world. And for pharma, you have 21 CFR 211. And then if you are in Europe, you have to follow GMP Annex 11. Lifecycle management becomes very critical. So whether you use TrackWise or Master Control or any of the PLM tools, from Windchill, Team Center, it becomes very critical that you do change control, do a periodic review of your process, of your change control to see if you need to make any changes, aligned to a CSA requirement. Uh, Overall, if you look at the summary, what we have covered today, so CSA is a cultural shift. It's not like that we have not been doing some of the elements of CSA earlier, but we are doing it more focused. We are not doing it just for compliance. We are doing it to make sure that we get a better, best product out in the market, which takes care of patient safety and caregivers as well as the employees who work in our organizations. Scope clarity, CSA complements doesn't replace. So just keep in mind that, CSV is still there. You will have to cover those elements as well. But it is an additional layer of whatever learning we have had in last, 15, 20, 30 years. We have sort of implemented as a community in CSA guideline. Justify what you test and why. Regulators want the thought process. I think it's very, very important. As Niyati mentioned, at a couple of places that, we sometimes we become too heavy in the documentation that we add a layer on top of the already available document to make sure that, we do the checkbox and do everything. But it becomes very important to really go deeper, understand what regulation is really expecting, and how are you aligning your needs to that rather than having 10 pages document. If you can justify that in 2 pages, everybody is going to love it. Obviously auditors would like it much better because it's concise, and since you have gone deeper into it, you would know the expectation of the regulation as well. Leverage vendor artifacts with documented and intended use verification. If you look at a lot of softwares, they are quite sophisticated. There's a lot of documentation they have, and they have made it a little bit easier now to understand what they are. And with data science and AI in the game, it becomes a lot more easier to ask a questions rather than going through 1,000-page document, and it takes you to where you need to really understand. It's a curated risk proportionate evidence, improves audit efficiency and business agility, which is very important in these kind of micro economic business challenges. Overall, the regulatory trend, what we see today is global principles consistent with CSA are emerging. So if you adopt a CSA earlier, is better. Uh, though not necessarily that it is formally adopted, but I think if you adopt early on and start going deeper, you'll be ahead of others. We can move on to next one. Niyati, looks like we are almost towards the end with so these are some of the references here, which we have taken for this presentation. So FDA guideline and Part 11 for FDA, as well as Annex 11 CSV guidance document and GMP 5 second edition. I think now we have Q&A. There you go. So Niyati, let me see. We have some questions. So some of the questions I have, which Satyam has printed for us. People have asked it beforehand, but I think let's take the questions which folks have asked in the live webinar. So there's a question from MA. I don't know his or her full name. The question is, when is the effective date for CSA approach implementation? So Nidhi, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so the effective date, from my understanding, is still not known. It's something that everybody's very curious to learn and see, and something we can take back and research more on. I think it was slated to be released sometime in 2025, but that is something that is still not fully known. So FDA, typically when they produce the draft guidances, they allow for a longer period of time for folks to provide suggestions, comments, and any type of changes. And so that period may still be going on. But yeah, it's a good question, when to really see when it's going to be fully published and released. So
No,
we are
that's a
still
good
waiting.
point. Absolutely. And I think while we are waiting, my recommendation would be that you shouldn't wait. You should understand the guidance document deeper, start implementing in smaller chunks of it, so that when date comes near, you should be ready. Our experience is that in past, there are a lot of draft guidances which come out, and people wait till the end, and then it's you are doing a catch-up job. You don't bring the quality. Since you are there in this webinar and you have learned about it, I would recommend that you start implementing as early as possible. Thanks, Niyati. There's one more question from
Absolutely.
the same uh, person. If a company decides to validate a system using CSV approach, would FDA have objection? Do you want to answer that?
Sure. And the question is really using a CSV approach or CSA approach?
It's CSV interestingly, so I don't know whether it's typo.
Yes.
Should have been
Yeah.
CSW.
Yeah, and I can answer both. So, as we covered right in our webinar, um, both CSV and CSA are defensible and acceptable methods. So, if the question is around CSV particularly, it's a very traditional, validation methodology used for many, many years by companies and very defensible. If it's done correctly, it is very solid and robust and compliant. It's just, the areas where we touched upon, where it's implemented across the board in the same way. And so you're testing every single element of that system, not doing sort of that prioritization based on risk. So that's where we kind of saw the difference between what is CSV and what is CSA. So both methods are, defensible in regulatory audits. And of course, CSV is a standard traditional method used for many, many years by companies. So you can definitely use CSV methodology if that makes the most sense for your business.
Perfect. I agree. I think thank you. We can take some questions which folks have asked before the webinar. Uh, Avinash has asked a question. How does unscripted testing and critical thinking fit in with CSA approach compared with scripted testing or even automated testing? Should I repeat,
So
Niyati? Yeah.
yeah, and so to understand clearly, Kuldeep, the question is about how does the unscripted testing fit in the CSA approach as opposed to the scripted testing,
That's
which
correct.
typically goes with the CSV approach. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So with, unscripted testing, really, when we looked at the risk-based framework, right? So we have to define intended use. You have a system, you'll define its intended use. You'll start to assess risks earlier in the process. And that's where you'll, start to prioritize what are those high and critical risk areas, and then areas where there is very little risk or no risk, really. And when you start to segregate them that way and understand the impactful areas that are GXP critical areas, impacting either product quality or patient safety, that's where you will start to determine that, it is not that I have to check every box and test every single thing. It will be more of that leveraged risk-based testing that I have to implement. And then you can tailor your testing based on that risk or prioritization. So you can call it as unscripted testing because it is not telling you, through the books that, hey, these are the areas you have to test. It's really based on your risk assessment, your thinking, your approach. You're now tailoring the testing based on that. And of course, very openly feel free to have really good controls on your vendors, because that is a critical piece in both CSA and CSV, because you must have assurance that your vendors are meeting your GXP requirements. And so definitely leverage a lot of that, artifacts that the vendors have produced. But yeah, tailor, don't make it scripted. CSV is really about every case is unique. Do your risk analysis and determine what testing you need to do.
Great, thank you. We can
I
take
hope.
maybe one or two more. Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think what you recommended is the right approach. We can take probably two more questions since we are a little over time. So Mark is asking a question, how to implement CSA for existing computerized systems and that were already implemented CSV?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, if you have already implemented a system using CSV, typically you would do your revalidation, periodic review of your system. That is probably like one of the really good times. Maybe you can evaluate, do I need to implement something different? And maybe think of it in a different manner when you're actually revalidating. And so that is maybe a perfect time, I would say, probably to think about, hey, let me shift from that traditional CSV method and think about, using CSA as an approach, and see how you can cut down on the efforts. You can have a risk-based, documented validation and still be able to meet compliance needs. So I think maybe that's where I would suggest, or I would, say is a good time to implement your CSA approach, which would be for an existing system, when you're doing revalidation.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think we can take one more, Niyati, and a couple of other questions. Probably we can email the answers. John has asked a question, which guidelines will you consider as comprehensive guidelines for CSV/CSA? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so we touched upon a lot of the reference guidances and regulations. I think some of the biggest guidelines in the computer system world, when you're doing either CSV or CSA, is make sure you read the FDA guidances. So both CSV and CSA have FDA guidances, the CSA being the draft guidance, which is still under review. CSV, there is a published guidance. So you can definitely familiarize yourself with both of them. The other critical one we touched upon is GAMP, guidance. It is a very necessary, absolutely, crucial guidance. You have to familiarize yourself if you truly going towards that CSA mindset. That will come handy, and it gives a lot of value. And then, if you have more business, if your company has outreach into other geographies and you have to follow EU requirements, for example, touch upon, Annex 11, we looked at that as well. There are some other guidances from the EU that you can touch upon on computerized systems. Data integrity, there is a whole separate guidance on data integrity from FDA. Definitely get familiarized with the data integrity guidance. It's really important for life sciences in general, because all of the data that you to keep, which is GXP and crucial, you must be aware of the data integrity requirements. So I think those are some of the ones that I would suggest to get familiarized. And of course, if you have devices, you are a device company, you typically you always follow that ISO 13485. It does have an element or a clause regarding computerized systems and validation. So definitely familiarize yourself with that clause. But yeah, ISO 13485 for medical devices is a rule book as well.
Great. I think that's really good, Niyati. I think we are 6 minutes over, so probably we can close the Q&A session. And I think, Niyati, if you want just to go to the next slide, which has Niyati's details and my details, right? So if you guys want to reach out to us, both of us or our common email ID, feel free to reach out. some of the questions which we could not answer here. So we're going to answer in an email in next few days. But no, I think I thank all of you for taking time on Friday to spend with us, and I hope it was really helpful. And Niti, thanks for doing the wonderful job in explaining everything for both CSV and CSA. And if I may, I would like to request you to say a few words before we summarize the webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Kuldeep, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a really good discussion. I'm very this topic is near and dear to me. So I really had a great time. And yeah, thank you all to the audiences who joined us today and on a Friday and took the time to spend with us to understand, this new concepts with validation. We appreciate your time and we look forward to, uh, come back again in the near future with interesting topics to discuss. But thank you again.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And you all have a good weekend. Take care. Thank you.